Hi, I'm Etta Spencer. Let's go to Vienna and Vancouver, and let's stay here in Toronto too with my friend Olivia Ward. And let's have a conversation, which I'm careful not to tell people what to talk about because this is a schmooze day, but I can pretty well guess because all of them have been to Afghanistan and two of them have been to Iraq and have worked in Iraq. And all of them are sort of peacenik types. In Here in Toronto, I'll start with Olivia Ward, who was foreign affairs lady. I don't know what the title was for the Toronto Star for ages. And I know you covered events in Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, and where else, Olivia?
Well, pretty much all over the former Soviet Union, which, as you know, broke down into wars in the 1990s. And that was kind of where I got a start, although I'd never planned on it. But my first war was Tajikistan, actually. And then over years, it sort of went through the Balkans and then it bounced back into, very briefly for me, into Afghanistan.
And you just don't look like a war correspondent is supposed to look like. I don't know, no trench coat.
Oh, you haven't seen me in my trench coat.
Okay, and let's go to Vienna next. Hello, Tariq Ralph, because I know you were born in Pakistan and used to go to Afghanistan for your summers or something, right?
Yes, that was many years ago when Afghanistan was at peace. So now I've sort of finished working at the Atomic Energy Agency and I'm tracking nuclear issues in North Korea, Iran, nuclear weapons policies of official quote unquote nuclear weapon states like the United States, China, and Russia. And today at some point I'd like to talk a little bit about a project at the Watson Institute at Brown University in the US. And they have a project called Costs of War. And they have estimated the total casualties caused since 2001 by these endless wars or wars on terror and also the casualties in Afghanistan and so on.
Wow, okay. I bet we certainly will come back to that. Corey Levine has returned several months ago from a long stint in Afghanistan where she worked for, is it UN Women, is that right? Mm-hmm. And just got back in time to witness from a distance the crumbling of the whole establishment that existed there. Tariq started this thing with a particular proposal. Why don't you talk a little bit first about this project, the Cost of War?
Yes, so everyone can access this if you go to Costs of War in Google, and it will take one to the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. So they have calculated that the endless war or the war on terror has resulted in nearly 929,000 deaths, 38 million people displaced in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan, Syria, and other places. And in Afghanistan alone, they have calculated there have been 176,000 deaths, of which nearly 46,000 civilians, 74 journalists and media workers, 446 humanitarian and NGO workers, and then 70,000 police and so on. So it's 176,000 casualties for Afghanistan. And they also say that the US has carried out 91,340 drone strikes across 7 major conflict zones, and between 22,700 to 48,300 civilians is the estimated casualty count, because it's very difficult to get an exact count. The United States really doesn't.
Casualties of the drone strikes.
Yes, the US doesn't really count civilian fatalities or injuries officially. They only count people that they have deemed as terrorists or so on, or their own people who might have been killed. So this is something that's not covered much. And also these counterterrorism activities have been carried out in 85 countries over the past decade or so.
Well,
So,
how many, sorry, but how many countries are doing it? I only hear about the US drones, but you know, there are other drone operations, right?
Yeah, there are in Libya, there are drone operations. Some of them ascribed to the Russians, some to the Americans, some to the Turks. In the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the Azeris used Turkish drones. The Israelis have used drones against the Gazans. Of course, in Yemen, we really don't know, but Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya have been the main theaters where drone strikes have taken place. Of course, the vast majority of them are US, but there are other countries as well.
Is there a global campaign against the use of drones that you know of?
Well, there is some discussion in what's called killer robots,
Right.
because drones are also a form of robot, and there is a concern that at the moment there is still a human operator behind the drone that takes the decision for the drone to fire its missile, like the one in Kabul during the time of the evacuation, where they hit this U.S. aid worker whom they thought was a terrorist. And one of their distinguishing characteristics for targeting this was that this person was driving a white Toyota. There are many thousands of white Toyota cars in Kabul. And actually, the Pentagon has concluded that while the strike was unfortunate, it was a legal strike. The decision to fire the missile at the target, which killed the 7 children or 10 children plus other people, was a legal decision. It's the same argument the U.S. used when in 1988, a U.S. destroyer shot down an Iran Airbus and killed 288 people. And the captain of that ship actually was given a medal on return to the U.S. that he had defended his ship properly in taking the required actions. It was just too bad that the plane that was hit was a passenger plane, which they mistook for Iranian Air Force fighter plane. But it's in very few countries where this legal defense is used in order to justify or defend military or police actions that result in civilians or non-combatants being targeted and being killed or injured.
Tarek, I'm sure you've followed this case, but as I had written some time ago about drones extensively, and one of the worst cases, for instance, was the 50 people who were killed in Pakistan on the border. And these were tribal leaders who were coming to a conference on some local issues that had nothing to do with terrorism, but they were mistaken, of course, for a terrorist group, and 50 people were killed. But the point of all this is that it's the difficulty for survivors and their relatives to be able to have any kind of accountability, because the cases, as you know, have gone through the courts. They've been prepared for the courts, being struck down, reinstated, and it just goes on and on. So it's not just that the definition of law is elastic, but once it's being declared legal, it's almost impossible for people to get any kind of redress.
Yes, I mean, sometimes they get some financial compensation, and they have to sign a paper that this compensation was voluntary, and it doesn't imply acceptance of any guilt or wrongdoing. But there have been wedding parties that have been hit by drone strikes. Funeral processions have been hit by drone strikes. And part of the problem is that in some of these cases, the information provided has come from a single source. And if the single source is wrong or they have their own agenda, they want to have people that they don't like hit, then they can call and tell the drone operators that these are Taliban or ISIS or whomsoever is the group that is being targeted, and there is no way of verifying this. And when there are people who are trigger happy, and most of these drones are controlled from a base in Nevada,
Right.
where they're called drone pilots. They report for 8-hour shifts, and then they go home to have dinner with their family at the end of their 8-hour shift. And during that shift, they might have erased somebody else's family tens of thousands of miles away. So there's no emotional connection. It's very much like playing a video game. And if one looks at video games, most of them are really very violent. They're all shooting and killing somebody or the other. And in most cases in the video games, the bad people or the targeted people are given to look like people from the Middle East or from the global South. And it's all the northern people or the Anglo-Saxon types who are the good guys and the heroes who are eliminating these threats, so to speak.
But there's also been some work done on the reactions of the people who are drone pilots in Nevada. And they found that quite a number of them have had severe PTSD, because once they actually sit back and think about what they've done, especially if they learn it's a mistake, they completely fall apart. And again, they've had very little support.
That's a good point. And actually, the majority of PTSD cases in the quote unquote allied troops is this remorse about firing indiscriminately and killing civilians. Even at the Kabul attack, the US forces at the gate just fired indiscriminately into the civilian crowd. And actually, some of the drone pilots have become really anti-war, and they've gone over to the other side, and they are highlighting the dangers of this remote warfare, artificial intelligence, and drones.
But I think it's not only a question of the elasticity of laws, which I think is a really excellent way of putting it, Olivia. But on the one hand, where technology is moving so fast and that law has a difficult time of catching up to technological advances. And I think that we've seen this in all areas, not just only within the laws of armed conflict. And I think that is part of the problem with a lack of accountability with the consequences of drone strikes and when innocent people are killed. On the other hand, with the new wars that are emerging globally, the Bush administration took the whole idea of non-combatants to an extreme, but there are lines that are blurring about what is, who is a civilian and who isn't. And I think this also has to be addressed, and that we have to have a better understanding of this. And actually, it was Malian soldiers that really helped me to understand that when I was doing some training on international humanitarian law, or the laws of armed conflict with them in Mali several years ago. I mean, in these kinds of new wars where it is inter-ethnic and with borders, international borders that actually don't have any meaning to the communities that live there, it becomes, a thing of, when you teach them the principles of international humanitarian law, the 4 basic principles of international humanitarian laws, and how targeting civilians is absolutely a no-go. And they say, well, tell us who is a civilian, because somebody comes out with a machine gun shoots at us, then puts on their wearing civilian clothes and merges back into the, the market or the town and goes home to their family as well. So these are questions that law also hasn't caught up with. The Geneva Conventions were created for laws that were much more cut and dried than the kinds of laws that we are, or the kinds of wars that we are seeing today. And I think this is where the, and then having the technology, the drone technology, removes the immediacy of it, removes the engagement of the person in that conflict. And while I can imagine that there is a lot of PTSD, if you're not engaged in that act personally, but done through a screen, and then you go home to dinner with your family, what kind of disconnect does that create within the person who is, who is engaged in this kind of technological warfare?
If we look at the Second World War, you had the partisans and the resistance. They were doing the same thing. They would go out and shoot German soldiers and then go back into the villages and become normal civilians. So to a certain extent, it's context driven. Many people in these conflicts had no intention of becoming fighters, but when their families were killed, part of this became revenge.
I have heard military people say, yes, there are lots of deaths caused by drones, but if they didn't have drones, they would use other military units going in and doing the same thing, and there would be a lot more deaths. And I don't know how you calculate that, but it is conceivable that, if you have a drone that can target one person down below, that they're going to kill fewer people than if they went after them with whole, squadrons of soldiers.
When these missiles on these drones cost several hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they don't want to, quote unquote, waste these missiles on just targeting one person. No. Even when the Americans targeted the Iranian General Soleimani at the Iraqi airport, there were a number of other people who were also killed, even though their primary target was a particular person. But the counter to that is with a drone strike is very antiseptic. It's something on a screen, you press a button, and you see a little puff of smoke, and that's it. But if you had to do a military assault, then one's own people are also exposed to the fire. And then it makes one think twice about, what type of military action one is undertaking, and there is a cost involved as well. So I don't think we can reduce it to this simple argument, which is generally used by the proponents of drone strikes, that it actually minimizes casualties, especially on one's own side as well. And there are propaganda videos out there. This was one made by the UK called Eye in the Sky. You can Google it and watch it on YouTube. And in this one, they are targeting a group of suicide bombers. But then when the time comes to hit them with the drone, a little girl shows up on the street. And then in this video, they show this moral dilemma. Should they strike? Because the suicide bombers, if they leave, they would cause mass casualties, whereas they hit them now, one little girl dies, but is that acceptable? And in the end, they do hit the thing, and they show that the girl is sort of killed or at least injured and being carried by her father. And that's where the video sort of fades out and ends.
Mm-hmm. I also remember reading something by Michael Ignatieff some years ago, just a moral argument that when one side has superb technology and invulnerability, as for example, the person who launches the drone strike is absolutely safe, there's no way they can get back at him, that the that the vulnerability in imbalance, or the discrepancy is so great that it is really immoral for anybody to use such a technological superiority in a war.
Vast majority of victims are now civilians because of technological advances. At the same time, though, war is still all about human intel. And as Tariq mentioned, people get their intel from individuals who may have personal access to Grind, or there may be other aspects and community dynamics that the foreigner doesn't have any understanding of. And this is how, and this doesn't only shape, the thing is a particular battle or going on, or a conflict. It can have repercussions down the road. For example, when the US has hand-chosen leaders that they put into power because they have assessed that person or that family as being, has vested interest in working with the Americans, or that's going to suit, American interests best. And the broader implications for that family, for the generations of people living there. So despite our technological advances, we're still, it's still about, individual assessment of what is going to further our interests, whether it's the Americans or another power in the country or in the region, deciding, which individuals are going to benefit and which individuals are going to not benefit, or communities, as it were.
Yeah, I would like to recommend a book by a German scholar. Her name is Elke Schwartz. And the title of her book is called Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies. And in this book of hers, she discusses whether lethal drones are the most moral and effective tools to combat terrorism, or whether killer robots could kill more ethically than humans. But in practice, these technologies often end up conflating efficiency with morality, legality, and ethicality. This is a point you were mentioning, Meta. For the pro side, the use of drones is argued to be as more justifiable because it is targeted and in theory would lead to less civilian casualties. Yet the empirical evidence suggests that the casualties are not minimized, and there are many casualties that are needless or excessive, and also the moral responsibility and the ethics of taking the decision to press the button to release the missile from the drone is also now sort of disconnected with the reality on the ground. Mm-hmm. So in modern war, soldiers are sort of, I wouldn't use the term brainwashed, but trained to regard the enemy as not human, because it is not in normal human nature to kill another human being, even if one hates them, unless, of course, one is mentally crazed or whatever. And so in order to get a soldier to fire a gun at an enemy, and particularly a soldier who has been deployed into an armed conflict for the first time, and for the first time they shoot somebody dead, it's a big moral decision for them, and many of these soldiers have written about this. The hesitancy, and therefore the training for them is that when given the order, they need to press the trigger and not question in their mind that the person at the other end may have a family and children like their own, or is a human being. They are to be treated or depicted as less than a human being, and therefore deserving of being killed.
You may even mention Dave Grossman's work on that. He had a book called On Killing, and his subsequent work continues to be about how the American Army has managed to overcome a lot of the reluctance that previous generations of soldiers have demonstrated. I mean, there have been cases in previous wars where they go around, they count I think even during the Civil War, they counted the number of spent bullets and the number of people who'd been hit. It was obvious that these lines of soldiers firing against each other were actually shooting over their heads or at the ground rather than killing each other on purpose. They clearly had to be intentionally missing because they didn't want the burden of having killed. So they'd rather take the chance of being killed themselves. But the US Army has overcome that by a number of such things as putting up targets that look like humans and making the people do it very, 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 very quickly. And then, of course, using video games and so on, so that as to just make it an automatic reflex almost. And that his work on video games is exactly showing that what we're doing with video games is exactly the thing that the Army has successfully used to overcome the resistance of normal recruits to killing, and that we're teaching teenagers how to be mass killers. And in fact, that virtually every single, not virtually, but literally every single mass killer that he has been able to study had already been addicted to video games as a way of, that's how they got into it. So I think your point, whether or not you're actually quoting Grossman or not, you indirectly are, because this is the research that I find really compelling about it.
So the U.S. learned from the First World War, which, got stalemated into the trenches. Mm-hmm. And millions of soldiers were killed, drowning in the trenches or being shot in the trenches and then being gassed in the trenches. So when they went into the Second World War, they came up with this doctrine of massive firepower, of overwhelming firepower. That if you go to a war, you need to have the maximum firepower that one can deploy in order to achieve a quick victory and to end the war quickly on one's own terms. But it doesn't always transpire that way. It's always this very massive firepower. It's the same thing when you see police shootings in the US. Every policeman empties all the bullets in their gun instead of just one policeman shooting one bullet at whomsoever might be they use the term villain, threatening the police. So this ease of using massive firepower is part of now the training. All military infrastructure needs to find a new enemy. Yeah. So once the Soviet Union collapsed, it became uncertainty, then the enemy became terrorism. And now that the terrorism battle is exhausted after 20 years, now it's China.
I think I interrupted Olivia.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that to an earlier point about training people to kill, I interviewed a number of Russian jet pilots, fighter pilots, who had killed many, many thousands of people. And what they almost all said was, the first time you get in that plane and you know what your mission is and you're going over a town or a civilian area, community, the first time you press the button to drop those bombs, you are traumatized. And you can visualize the people on the ground that are dying. The second time, it's less so. And by about the third time, you become completely numb and it's a job.
Well, that's really fascinating. And I wonder if it really holds up in the long term, because you think ahead to the fact that after these guys come home, the rate of suicide and the mental illness and so on of the veterans, even many, many years later, is extremely high. I believe that I've seen that the figures that in the US anyway, that there are more people who committed suicide after returning home as a veteran, war veteran, than were killed in the war. Am I mistaken, or is that, I don't think I made that up, but I can't be sure I'm telling the truth about that. Do you remember
No,
hearing
that's
that?
correct.
It is, okay. So it may be there's a delayed reaction, Olivia. Did any of them say that that could have been the case for these guys you interviewed?
It had not so far, and I'm sure there were people who had a reaction and who were not talking to me. But I think what happens is that they engage in numbing behavior when they get back. And of course, in Russia, as you know, it's commonly known, there's tremendously high rate of alcoholism.
Mhm.
There's also a very high rate of domestic abuse.
Mhm.
And in fact, it's interesting because I've also seen this in Kosovo, where I was talking to women that I knew who were the partners or wives of KLA fighters. And they thoroughly believed in the cause of independence. They believed that they were fighting for the right thing. But in, I think, every case of, the small sample of the women that I knew, the marriages or the partnerships broke down. And the women said in every case, they could not stay with the men because they were no longer the same people.
Mm-hmm. I have a friend, I haven't seen him a couple of years, but he was a Karen fighter in the jungles in Burma for 17 years against the Burmese army, I guess. And he was a sniper. And he said he went in because his brother had been killed, and he felt he had to leave his family and go join the army. So he said that it was like a sport for him, that he went there to kill the enemy. And whenever he had a chance to kill, he felt thrilled, and it was exuberant, like his team had just won the biggest trophy that they make. And every night he couldn't sleep because he was so excited about having killed. And it went on and on. When he killed dozens, I don't know how many people, but that he never. And I remember he was sitting at my dinner table telling me this, and it was like he was looking back at himself thinking, this was such a strange psychological condition to be in. But it wasn't like remorse. It was like he was trying to analyze his own weird reaction and reflecting on this, the pleasure that he got from killing.
Thank you, Olivia, for bringing up the issue of domestic abuse, because it has been shown that it always increases quite significantly in war. It's prevalent in every society, but tends to significantly go up. Not only because of there's a prevalence of weapons, but also an increased violence in society in general. But in the current work that I'm doing on with Afghanistan, I'm meeting a lot of different types of people. Soldiers, former soldiers, reservists, some you could probably call mercenaries. And there's a very black and white attitude to the work of, it's like, okay, it's the good guys versus the bad guys. And it's a very binary world. And I understand, I guess as a military person, this is the way that you must approach conflict. But when I'm thinking about Afghanistan, I mean, I'm involved in protection and rescue work, and wanting to make sure that people who are being targeted by the Taliban are safe. But other than the leadership of the Taliban, the vast majority of them are, illiterate men, often young boys who don't really understand anything of the broader world, other than that they've been given a gun from a very early age, and they've been taught certain things. So I think we need to get beyond this kind of binary approach of bad guys and good guys.
Mm.
I still don't want the Taliban to have official recognition. I understand that the Taliban, we need to work with them because they are in power, but they are there illegitimately. But yeah, this kind of black and white thing also doesn't help in how do we move forward? How do we move forward in ensuring that there's, humanitarian efforts can proceed given the looming crisis that's most are saying that's going to be the worst humanitarian crisis, in a generation. So we have to, in everything, war, I think, is something that creates the most black and white divides, and yet, in my experience of more than 20 years of working in war zones, it is the nexus of many different complex and complicated issues, and that we need to bring the nuances into this conversation and away from the black and white.
Can I bring up a question then that came out of my conversation with Mary Caldor? Because her basic consideration was that, they had it backwards, that the goal of the war against in Afghanistan was counterterrorism and the protection of U.S. or of Western interests. But her feeling was they should have made peace with the Taliban. They should have treated the Al-Qaeda people by police action, have some sort of police rather than military action where they capture them, put them on trial, etc., for war crimes. But that the goal of the action there should be the protection of the security of the Afghan people, not the Western people. And that the whole objective of the war was backward. Would any of you agree to such a redefinition of what should have happened in Afghanistan from the get-go?
Well, while you were talking about this, and I know also, I'm sure Corey has a very considered opinion on this, but what I'm wondering, and I'd like to ask her particularly, is the West, and I would say the Western countries in general, seem to be thinking that you can make a deal with the Taliban. You can have some kind of peaceful arrangement, even if it's not recognition, but some kind of peaceful arrangement with them whereby they agree to abide by certain human rights concepts. And in exchange, they get the aid that they need to keep the country going and keep people fed, etc. But my question, and particularly I think to Corey, is really, does the Taliban care when their whole ideology is based on what I consider a war on women? So this is something that is intrinsic to the nature of the Taliban. It's not just a figment or one of the things that you might bargain with them about, because this is part of their rock solid ideology. So is there any bargaining with the Taliban? And is there anything that can be done to protect the vulnerable population, and particularly women, under these circumstances?
Thank you so much, Olivia, for that question. As a feminist, I completely agree with your analysis. I struggle when I hear, I've known Mary Calder for a long time. It's originally actually how I met Meta through. I admire her work greatly, but I am first and foremost a woman. And it's true, their ideology is intrinsic to who they are. they are not going to make any changes to that ideology. Talks around Taliban 2.0 are, I don't know where this comes from, because the only thing the Taliban have learned in their 20 years out of power is, what to say and how to talk. But their actions speak much louder than their words, and they are carrying on this continued war against women and girls. There's no question about that. Um, but just to take it back to what Meta said originally, I don't think, peace necessarily should have been negotiated with the Taliban. Should have been some kind of negotiations with them. We saw what the Western allies did in Iraq and Afghanistan. They did the same thing, which is what they took the parties that were in power and they vanquished them and completely, attempted to remove all trace of them. Well, in the end, you have very aggrieved fighters, you have aggrieved communities, and all this does is just perpetuate the conflict. So I do agree with Mary to a certain extent that there needed to be some accommodation, I guess. Maybe negotiation is not the right word, but we can trace this back to almost any war. And Margaret Macmillan has, very clearly outlined if you take the enemy and turn them into, remove, all sense of dignity from them, if you create harsh conditions, it's going to come back and bite you. And this is what we saw in Iraq with the rise of ISIS, what we've seen in Afghanistan now. So those are the realities. That takes me back to the nuances. This is the kind of nuances that you have to engage in. But I completely agree with Olivia. At the end of the day, the Taliban ideology is a war against females, and that cannot be forgotten, and there's no room for negotiation as far as the Taliban is concerned with that. And so that needs to be addressed first and foremost.
So what else would you do? Just in practical terms, you don't quite negotiate, but you go in nuance with them. I mean, what do you do?
I think what you do is you recognize that they represent communities, like not, all Taliban necessarily agree with everything. You recognize that, and Tariq can actually say a lot to the rise of the Taliban, because they, this is, they arose because ISI in Pakistan, the secret intelligence services had, it served their purpose to have a group such as this. So first of all, I think you have to bring Pakistan into the game and, look at these issues on a broader regional basis. But at the same time, you also have to look at community grievances, which is part of what is the makeup of the Taliban, with the vast majority or all of them being represented by the Pashtun community. And what are the grievances within the Pashtun community? So you have to get, down into those subtle, the subtleties, as well as the broader geopolitical aspects of it. That's my personal feeling.
Mm-hmm. But, speaking of Pakistan, and I'd asked Tariq, what what do you think? I think that bringing Pakistan into this is of course an excellent idea because they have so much sway, but basically the ISI has so much sway, and yet they would negotiate probably with Imran Khan rather than the ISI. And Imran Khan, sadly, is in thrall to the ISI. So, Tariq, what do you think? I mean, is there any way out of that box?
I think we need to roll back. Once the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 and the resistance to them started, it was the US that made it into a holy war and a jihad. And you have Zbigniew Brzezinski going to the border and saying, you are fighting God's war. And then the US administration brought in the religious element. Rather than bringing in a nationalist element of the Afghans pushing out a foreign invader, they made it a holy war, a jihad. And so this whole problem starts there. And so once the Soviets leave in 1989, then all the external aid dries up and everyone goes away. And then from 1989 to 2001, these 10, 11 years, these jihadis who were controlling parts of Afghanistan were engaging in cultivation of heroin and other drugs to finance themselves. Then different warlords started collecting tolls on the various roads and generally terrorizing people. And so then this group was formed by this fellow called Mullah Omar, called the Talibs. A Talib is sort of a student, can be a student of anything, but in this case, they ended up being students of Islam and the Quran. And so this group led by Mullah Omar went into one area and they cleared out the old Afghan jihadis. And then other groups wanted the same thing because these people restored order in their own way. And so that's how the Taliban were born. So they weren't really a creation of the ISI. They were a creation of the Afghans themselves who got tired of the veterans of the Afghan war against the Soviets. But then the people who joined this Taliban, they all ended up being sort of followers of a very conservative Saudi interpretation of Islam because that's where the money came from. And that is where this war against women also comes from. You know, it's also in Saudi Arabia where women couldn't drive, women weren't really a person, they couldn't go out on the street without a male companion, they couldn't have a passport, they couldn't leave the country. So the war against women in Saudi Arabia was, to use a term, a little bit less austere than the version practiced by the Taliban. And as I think Corey mentioned, most of these are illiterate people, and they are actually afraid of women, and that's part of it. It's part of the reason for. It's afraid of.
What is there to be afraid of that women might do? That's fascinating.
Yes. Women might do better things, and women control. You know, women create new life, etc., etc. So they're more. So the way is to keep them bound in the kitchen and in the house and that type of stuff. And so as the Taliban then took hold, that is where Al Qaeda came in as well. So a lot of the Arab fighters, also from the veterans of the war against the Soviet Union, they are the ones who created this version of Al Qaeda, and then you had Bin Laden. So the reason why the US went into Afghanistan in October or whenever it was of 2001 was to get Osama bin Laden, whom the Taliban refused to surrender because they said under our culture we cannot surrender a guest. But then once Osama bin Laden escaped from Tora Bora, then that part of the mission of grabbing Osama bin Laden sort of was finished. And that's where I think what we were just discussing is when the international forces should have found a way of talking to the Taliban and creating an administration where they could be humanized or civilized, so to speak. But then, you know, this war created its own momentum. There was this anger and hatred in the international forces against the Taliban and others for helping Osama bin Laden escape. The Pakistanis had their own agenda. They didn't want Afghanistan to fall under Indian influence because the Indians were also active in there. And so it really becomes a really muddled pot. And then you have 4 million refugees, Afghan refugees from the first war living in Pakistan, and the border is very fluid. It's not really a well-defined border. So different countries had different rationales, which all collided in Afghanistan. And then, I don't know how many generals the U.S. had commanding the international troops. I think 13 in 20 years and so on. And each one of these was a macho general who was going to finish the war. And they were also fooling their own presidents back home that, just give us more time, more troops, and we are going to solve this. And it never really happened, and it acquired its own momentum. And then by bringing in Hamid Karzai and Ghani, who really had no following in Afghanistan, these are, transplanted from the World Bank or wherever these people were working. And same thing with the U.S. representative, Zalmay Khalilzad, who has been the U.S. Afghan going back, I think, to Reagan times. So it's very complicated. And now the situation is that with the quote-unquote victory of the Taliban, the Islamist extremist forces have been emboldened. And just yesterday or today, the Pakistani government capitulated to a radical Islamist group that had commandeered hundreds of thousands of people on the road. They killed 9 policemen in cold blood. They want their leader released from prison. They want their group removed from the list of prohibited groups.
Wait, hold on. We're talking about Pakistan now. Pakistan, the extremists have been emboldened by the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan now.
Yeah, because they say if we were successful in having an emirate created in Afghanistan, we now want an emirate created in Pakistan. And this is not a new phenomenon. There have been many radical Islamist groups in Pakistan that have been trying to create an emirate, but they never get more than 2% of the vote. And they never were able to place people in parliament. But again, the Pakistani military.
Let's ask this. If the question really is what should they have done? What should we or whoever have done about, rather than go to war against the Taliban, what could we have done that might have changed their minds or changed the culture in some way that would have softened them up 20 years ago? But now we got a new opportunity to do that in Pakistan because, as you're saying, there's a growth of the same movement in Pakistan. Maybe let's experiment and see what we can do other than what we obviously didn't succeed with in Afghanistan. Is there anything at all that anybody has as a proposal for how you deal with it with ignorant people? I mean, we were talking about beforehand about anti-vaxxer people. And how do you deal with people who, from my point of view, just ignorant people? Well, the same thing here. What are you going to do with people like Taliban people who hate women? And maybe it's as simple as that. You've got to find a better answer.
Yeah, so I think that the Taliban now are not listening to the Pakistanis. They don't have any leverage over them. They say to the Taliban, to the Pakistanis, leave us. We won the war. We're going to govern our own country. So my personal view is that the international community should not provide international assistance unless the Taliban are asked to have some sort of an election and ask the people of Afghanistan whether they want the Taliban.
Starving. Right now, people literally starving to death. Olivia, and we have about 2 minutes. I want to hear from both of you about this, the thorny issue. What do you do?
Well, I think that there are 2 questions as far as I'm concerned. One of them is the very immediate question that Corey has raised so well, which is, what do we do about the people who are now threatened in Afghanistan and need to get out urgently? Because that is a situation that's getting worse constantly. And the second thing is, what do you do about this coming very cold in every sense winter that the Afghan people have to get through? And so many of them are either starving or they will starve.
Yeah. Corey?
Yeah, I agree. Those are absolutely the two most pressing questions. I do not believe in using people as leverage for getting a change in regime. That never works. Yes, it would be great to see ideally democratic elections happening in Afghanistan, although there have in the past 20 years, the elections haven't been that democratic, I would have to say. And the Taliban are not going to agree to this because, again, going back to their ideology, they see this as, that this is their legitimate right to be there as rulers, and the concept of elections is completely foreign to them. So we have to deal with the two immediate crises. And to me, this means that the Western allies and our government, our Canadian government, need to get their act together. And then rather than doing the posturing that they've been doing, they need to step up and act. Canada spent, more than $3 billion in Afghanistan over a 20-year period. The US spent, I think, in the trillions in Afghanistan, and the rest of the Western countries. I mean, spending millions to get people out of Afghanistan, get them somewhere safe, get them processed, and bring them to Canada and other Western countries and provide services to integrate them here is a fraction of what was spent for 20 years. There are many ways that that humanitarian assistance can be provided without necessarily directly going through the Taliban, although recognizing that the UN, which is in their delivering aid at the moment, does have to negotiate with the Taliban to get access. This is the reality, and that's not going to change on the ground. But negotiating is different than providing them with the means to do it themselves, to distribute it. So I think we need to put pressure on our government and our Western allies to really step up to meet the needs, the crisis at hand.
This is so interesting, and we could go on all day. It's very important, and I hate to call it to a close because it's so urgent, but there you go. Thank you all. It's been wonderful, and good to see you, and carry on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.